Okay, folks, last instructor video of the week. I want to give you a brief overview of Aegean culture and do so as I did with Mesopotamian Egypt through the art of that culture. Now, it has occurred to me that already in this class, I've used the word culture quite a lot. Of course, the name is in the course title, Ancient and Medieval Cultures. So I thought it would be the least I could do to give you a kind of working definition of culture. It's actually a very hard word to define, and there are arguments about it, but I'm just going to give us a working definition that may not be perfect, but good enough for our purposes. I want to define culture as a set of interrelated beliefs and behaviors widely shared among a group of people. I'll repeat that. An interrelated set of beliefs and behaviors that are widely shared among a group of people. So that's meant to be a very broad definition. According to a definition like that, things like art, religion, literature, it's all part of culture. Just to give you a concrete example of what I mean, let's look at Western culture, which is the focus of the course. Let's begin with a belief. In modern Western culture, there is a widespread belief that diseases have scientific explanations, that one need not appeal to the realm of the demonic or curses, but one can point to biology and chemistry and explain disease. Now, because of that belief, we in modern Western culture behave in a certain way. So when we get sick, the first person we consult is typically not our pastor or religious leader, but rather a physician, right? So that's what I mean when I talk about interrelated beliefs and behaviors, because we believe in certain ways, we behave in certain ways. Now, again, we take these things for granted, but when you study other cultures from the past and sometimes from the present, you'll see that some of our own beliefs and behaviors are not actually accepted in other cultures. And again, just because you can find exceptions to that, that does not disprove the rule. So as long as those beliefs and behaviors are widespread, that's good enough. They don't have to be held by every single individual. All right. Now, to get back to the logic of the course and the logic of what we're doing this week, again, why are we looking at all these different cultures this week? We started with the Mesopotamians, then the Egyptians, and today we're really going to be talking about a couple of different cultures that are all concentrated in the Aegean region. I'll just remind you again that the ultimate goal of the course is to help us understand how Western culture came to be what it is today. So all of the cultures we've looked at so far and will look at have contributed something important to Western culture. I mean, think about Paleolithic culture, right? Paleolithic people invented like art and religion. Well, those are still things very much with us. The Neolithic culture invented agriculture, something that our lives still depend on today. The Mesopotamians gave us cities and writing. The Egyptians also gave us writing, also gave us a kind of optimistic view of the afterlife that many people still share today, whether they're Christian or not. The Israelites, about whom you'll be reading on West in the World, and I guess Akhenaten too, gave us the idea of monotheism. So again, that's why we're looking at all these cultures. Now, the cultures we'll be looking at today Again, they are geographically united because they were all found in the Aegean basin, but they all sort of absorbed influences from other cultures like Egyptian culture. We'll see several examples of that. And these cultures, only one culture we'll look at today is actually Greek. But all the cultures we'll look at today are going to sort of transmit some things to later Greeks. And Greek culture is one of the major ingredients of Western culture as we know it today. So again, it's all about how did we get here today. All right, so let me go ahead and show you a map of the Aegean region so you can be very clear as to where this is. So you see the Aegean Sea, it sort of separates Asia from Europe. So you've got the Greek peninsula there on the western side, and then Asia Minor on the eastern side. And, you know, you can imagine just by looking at this map that the sea itself, maritime travel is going to be very important to this culture. Now, there's not just one monolithic Aegean culture. There are several different ones, but as you might imagine, there's going to be a lot of cross-pollination between them. The period of time we'll be talking about today is roughly the same period we've been looking at with those other cultures. So something like 3000 to 1000 BCE or BC. Okay, so I want to start with Cycladic culture. Actually, if you look at that map, you can see the Cyclades Islands that are found in the southern part of the Aegean Sea. So that's where we get the name Cycladic culture. And if you look really closely, if you have good eyesight, you can see that the southernmost of the Cycladic Islands is an island known as Thera, Thera, known today as Santorini. And they produced, there was a kind of common Cycladic culture, and they produced some significant art that we still have today. So, you know, one good example would be this boxing children fresco, okay, which is about 9 feet by 3 feet in size. We're going to be looking at a number of frescoes in this course, and if you go on to take Humanities 102, a bunch more there. So let's go ahead and define what a fresco is. It's a study guide term. A fresco is a type of painting that is created by mixing pigments with wet plaster. So paint and wet plaster. So you paint on the plaster while it's wet, and then it dries and creates a permanent work of art. What exactly is going on here in this fresco? Not entirely clear. Is this just an athletic bout? Is this some sort of coming of age ritual or religious ritual? It's very hard to know. One thing is clear though, there is a distinct Egyptian influence here. So this culture, the Cycladic culture, was not cut off from the larger Mediterranean. And I think you probably can figure out for yourself where that Egyptian influence is most obvious. It's in the fact that you have bodies in profile, but you have those eyes that are frontal. We're not looking at the eyes in profile. So it's sort of unrealistic in that sense. It's also quite two-dimensional. There's no real effort to create an illusion of depth, and that too is reminiscent of Egyptian art. Now, it's not by any means a kind of carbon copy of Egyptian art. It's much more curvilinear. They're more sort of curving lines, and it's more dynamic. You have a sense that the artist is capturing this moment of motion and action, which is often not the case with Egyptian art. So the Cycladic culture was clearly taking other cultural influences on board, but then kind of doing their own thing with them. Now, that's all I'm going to say about Cycladic culture and the culture that flourished on the island of Thera. I want to move on to our next major culture, which is Minoan culture, okay, which flourished from about 2000 to 1450 BCE. Now, Minoan culture was based on the island of Crete. But what I want to emphasize right from the get-go is that the Minoans were actually not Greeks. Now, that's confusing because the island of Crete is culturally and politically Greek today. But that was not the case then. Now, you might ask, well, what makes a culture Greek or not Greek? And the answer is very simple. We describe a culture as being Greek if they speak some form of the Greek language. And the Minoans did not. They spoke a Semitic language, so a language that was related actually to Hebrew, not related to the Greek language. And not only did they speak a language, of course, but they were a literate culture. They had their own writing system, and that is what you're looking at right now. It's what scholars have described as Linear A. So the good news is we have some inscriptions in Linear A. The bad news is that scholars have no idea what they say. So scholars have not been able to crack the code. They cannot decipher this language. Now, it should not be surprising that the Minoans had a written language because the Minoans had a very urban, city-based culture. And one thing we've already learned in this course is that writing really only comes to be in a kind of urban environment, at least in the cultures that we've studied so far. Some of the cities of Minoa, in Minoan culture were quite large, like Knossos, that's K-N-O-S. Actually, let me see, I think I have a slide here. Yeah, K-N-O-S-S-O-S. Knossos had maybe 40,000 people, something like that. So a very large city by the standards of the ancient world. And what we're looking at right here is a partial reconstruction of the palace at Knossos. Now, this is not the only such Minoan palace. The Minoan culture was a palace-based culture. Now, we call them palaces. Archaeologists call them palaces. Of course, that name implies that they were royal residences. That's certainly possible, perhaps even probable, but it's not certain. There's still a lot of mystery as to, all the purposes that these palaces actually held. But a couple of things we do know. One is that they were quite large and they were quite confusing. They were large, sprawling. They're places that would be very easy to get lost in, okay? And this is actually where our word labyrinth comes from, because that term has been used to describe these Minoan palaces. It also seems quite certain that whether or not they were royal residences, these were multi-purpose buildings. So they seem to have been commercial spaces. There were storehouses in these palaces. They also seem to have been religious centers. So you would find shrines, religious shrines in these palaces. One interesting thing about Minoan culture is that they apparently did not have separate temples for the gods. They would just have these shrines that were a part of these larger palace structures. Now, speaking of Minoan religion, I mean, obviously, again, given the fact that we can't read their script. There's only so much we can say. But let's look at one example of Minoan art. This is a snake goddess statue. It's a little over a foot tall. Don't ask me about the cat on her head. I can't answer that. But given the snakes, which are phallus symbols, given the exposed breasts, this seems clearly to be some kind of symbol of fertility, or perhaps a fertility goddess in some way. But beyond that, it's very hard to say. I do want to look at one other work of Minoan art, the Leaping Bull fresco. One of the things that really stands out, especially if you look at a close-up, I think I have one for you here. Yes, I do. This should look very familiar, partly because of the boxing children fresco we just looked at. And in turn, because of the Egyptian art that we looked at. So same thing, right? Figures standing in profile with the frontal eye. But again, this is a much more kind of dynamic and curvilinear and work of art than really anything we saw from Egyptian culture. Notice, by the way, that the character that is leaping over the bull is much darker, so probably a male figure, and then two light-skinned women on each side of the bull. Again, an Egyptian convention. Now, in terms of what exactly is happening here, I mean, it is clear from other evidence that bull leaping was a thing in Minoan culture. Again, was it just an athletic endeavor? Was it a kind of religious ritual? Was it possibly even a prelude to human sacrifice? Some scholars have speculated about that. Very, very hard to know, and really impossible to know for sure. We can only speculate. Now, the Minoans, they have their centuries in the sun, but their culture really is kind of extinguished around the year 1400. It's hard to know exactly what happened. Some sort of military conquest, possibly aided by an eruption of a volcano and a tsunami. And so Crete ends up getting taken over by the Mycenaeans. And that's the next culture that I want to talk about, the final culture that I want to talk about in this video. The Mycenaeans get their name from the city of Mycenae, which is in mainland Greece. And this is an actual Greek culture. Okay, because the Mycenaeans spoke a Greek dialect. So this is really the earliest Greek culture that we know really anything about. Like the Minoans, they were literate. We have examples of their script, which is known as linear B. Remember, Minoans have linear A, Mycenaeans have linear B, and fortunately, linear B has been deciphered. So that's helped scholars have a little bit more knowledge of Mycenaean culture, even though there's still a lot of guesswork involved. Now, one of the things we can say in general about the Mycenaeans is illustrated by this image, the Lion Gate, and that is that the Mycenaean people were a warlike people, a people in a constant state of preparation for war, if not constantly engaged in war. In contrast to the Minoans, who had these great cities, but their cities were unwalled, the Mycenaeans built these great walls around their city. And the Lion Gate is a part of that wall that surrounded the city of the citadel of Mycenae. Well, what else do we know about the Mycenaeans? They seem to have had very powerful kings, not quite at the level of pharaohs, but powerful kings nonetheless. Now, one of the most famous kings of Greek mythology is Agamemnon, and you'll be reading some about him when we read the Odyssey. Now, a grave was excavated, a Mycenaean grave was excavated, a grave that may well have belonged to a king, and this mask was found there. Now, it's not even certain that there was a historical figure named Agamemnon, much less that this mask belonged to him. But no matter, this very well may have been the mask of a king, probably a death mask that was created to, in some way, extend the identity of the king, to extend his life into the afterlife. This is made of pure hammered gold, so whoever this was extremely wealthy, and hence likely a king. And this was a common practice of Mycenaean royalty to fill their tombs not only with death masks like this, but any number of sort of luxurious grave goods. And this brings me to the final work that I want to talk about. And this is very exciting. This is a tomb that was just excavated in 2015, so just about 6 years ago. And they call it the Tomb of the Griffin Warrior. And I don't know how they did it exactly, but archaeologists have kind of reconstructed what they think this warrior may have looked like. And that's what you see in front of you. In this particular tomb, there were something like 3,000 different burial objects. So a very lavish kind of burial. Again, the figure may not have been a king, but clearly he was an elite figure in Mycenaean society. Now, among those 3,000 grave goods, archaeologists found this signet ring. Now, I just wanted to show this to you because it is so similar to the bull leaping fresco that we looked at just a moment ago. And remember, that was Minoan. And this is a Mycenaean tomb. So one thing this displays very clearly is that Minoan culture exerted real influence on Mycenaean culture. This is the kind of cross-pollination I was talking about earlier. Now, the next thing I want to show you is just absolutely one of my favorite objects from the ancient world. Again, it's only been discovered for a few years now. The archaeologists were going through, these thousands of different objects in the Griffin warrior's tomb, and they found a very kind of unprepossessing little bead that looked like that. Okay, very small, just a few, a couple of inches long. But as you can see here, it was covered by this kind of limestone crust. Well, they spent about a year or so very carefully removing that limestone crust. And when they did, they found this underneath. Okay. Take a moment just to appreciate the incredible anatomical realism. If you look at the torsos of the bodies, or if you look at the musculature of these figures, incredible detail. Again, this is a small object. Some of these little details that you see on this object are only about 1/2 millimeter in length. Most scholars and art historians did not think that there was any art in the Western world this realistic until about 1,000 years after this. So, I mean, as we speak, art historians are literally having to rewrite the history of Greek sculpture based on this astonishing work. It's also probably the first battle scene in the history of Western art. So there's all sorts of reasons why this was a real significant find. Um, so I hope that gives you some appreciation for the kind of sophistication that ancient artists were capable of. I mean, even this was like 700 years before Homer. And this is a very, very old work of art. Well, like the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, their civilization will also collapse. And it collapses around 1177, a time where you see all these different civilizations just sort of toppling like dominoes throughout the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. So, you know, just as Mycenaean culture is collapsing, that's the same time that the new kingdom in Egypt is collapsing. The Hittites, the Babylonians, the Trojans, they all lose their empires as well, and the Bronze Age comes to an end. No, we can't be certain as to what happened, but probably a kind of perfect storm of disasters. Disasters that included drought caused by climate change, natural disasters like earthquakes, and the appearance of a new group of warlike people known as the Sea Peoples. The Philistines from the Bible, they were one of these Sea Peoples. So the downfall of Mycenaean civilization is part of a much larger phenomenon, a kind of remaking of the ancient Near East. All right, well, I will leave you with that lovely image and see you next week.